Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Thank you so much for joining me as we begin our study on First Corinthians. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I do hope that you enjoy the content. And as we continue to dig into, or as we begin digging into First Corinthians, and go into the history today, that's my plan, is just to go over the history of the city of Corinth and what was going on and what was happening at that time and why the people were living the way they were, and even why Paul felt the need to address some of these things of what the book is going to be about. So that's what this first lesson is going to be. So I want to thank you so much for being here. I would suggest that might be a good idea for you to have a notepad and a pen or a couple of pens so you can take some notes and learn along with me. I would really appreciate it if, as we go along, you would leave comments in the comment section so that we can have a really rounded dialogue and a conversation as we continue. So I would like if you would also share this so that other people that you know who you feel might be interested in being a part of this community would also be able to join. So thank you so much for all of that. I appreciate it immensely. Also like it and subscribe if you're not subscribed. So having said all of that, let's get started. And I want to start by saying this. There is a saying, and I've heard a few people say it today, and that saying is this, that, they don't have anything against Jesus. They love Jesus. They'd love to go to church, but they just don't want to have anything to do with what's happening in the church. Maybe you've heard that too. It can sound something like, Jesus, yeah, the church, no. So it can have a couple of different feelings to it as you go along. So I wanted to just start by saying, not so different then as it is today. And the thing is as those words come off of our tongue, it really does fly in the face of something that Jesus said. And Jesus said that we are not to forsake the gathering of ourselves together. He said that. And so interesting thought, that people want to be able to stay home. And it's so easy today. We've got YouTube messages, sermons. You can plug into anybody that you want and learn anything that you want. You can, just sit down for 4 hours on a Sunday and just really swallow up 2 or 3 or 4 different messages. So all of those things can be great, and they certainly have their place, but we need each other. The truth is that we need to be able to sit down, look eyeball to eyeball, and have conversations, or in this case, write them in the comments and have conversations in the comments, because I think that is so important. We need one another in all things all the time. We need fellowship. And we need fellowship because we tend to do better with others, other people's input, other people's love and acceptance. If we are by ourselves too much, we can feel like a lone ranger. We can feel like we're standing and talking and all we're doing is all by ourselves and we don't feel supported at all. That doesn't work very well for us in the long run. So we do need Jesus, absolutely. First and foremost, he is the one and the number one thing that we should be pursuing. But we also need people. So let's get into the content. Let's get into what was going on in Corinth. Let's get into when was it written? Why was it written? All of those things. So in 56 or 57 AD is the time when the Apostle Paul wrote this letter, and he wrote it from Ephesians during his 3rd missionary journey. He wrote the letter to address the problems he had learned were happening within this particular body of believers. And so he actually took the bull by the horns and he went and he said, you know what, we're having some issues here. And I want to address them because this is not the way that the church should be handling itself. So this tells us a few things. It tells us that the Church of Corinth was not in a good place in 56 AD when this letter was written. They were in trouble. And those around them who were non-believers were aware of the problems that were going on inside the church. And they didn't like it. Does that sound familiar? It might. I've heard some of these things, like I said, today. So the problem with non-believers knowing the sins of the saints is that it can give 2 opportunities to happen, maybe even 3. One is that it allows them to condemn God. because his people aren't living any differently than they are in the world. And the people of Corinth could see that. They could see that what was happening in the church was no different than what was happening outside of the church. And so it allowed them to condemn God and condemn the people. But the second opportunity is that it gave them the option to fall even deeper into sin. Because if the church is supposed to set a standard, and it wasn't at that time, well, then the sky's the limit, right? Like if it's okay to do the same things they were doing inside the church, then surely they must have been able to do more. But then there's a third thing here, and that is that it also gives the enemy the ability to work in the minds of those that are lost with the intention of keeping them from salvation. We need to consider that, how we live our life does have an impact on the people around us. And the enemy will take every opportunity for the people that are not saved to keep them from salvation, to keep them turned off of the things of the gospel. But he's also going to use those same things to trip us up and to trap us and to cause us to fall. So just some food for thought there. So some of the questions I might have at this point are this. If you are aware of some of the sins or things that are going on in the church, some of the failures that are happening, and who isn't today with multi-sites that we can go to and news outlets and social media sites, of course, we're aware of what's going on inside of the church. So that's the first question. If you know, what are you doing about it? And the second thing is, are you aware of what you're doing? Are you aware of how your life is being presented to other people? There's no condemnation here. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to look at you and say you need to shape up and you need to do things differently. That's not what I'm doing here. This is just a question, because as we read this letter, this is the question, one of the questions that Paul is asking, not only to the Corinthian church, but I believe to us today. So as we continue, we can see that there have been enough examples throughout church history that equals the tensions of what was going on in Corinth at the time. I'm not going to name them, but if you give it a thought for just a second, you can probably come up with a few. For example, there was immorality of the intimate kind, trying to be careful with my words here, immorality of the intimate kind going on among some of the members of the church. And some of those same people and some other people were getting drunk, and other people were using what I'll call the greasy grace message to excuse their sinful way of living. You can read about that in Romans, because he addresses that issue in Romans. But the other thing is, the church was divided and had different groups of people competing for leadership. So it wasn't a stable environment. It wasn't a comfortable environment. It didn't feel, even reading it, does it feel safe to you? It doesn't really feel safe, and it certainly doesn't feel united. So this was what was going on inside the church of Corinth at this time. So the church in that day was hindering the progress of the gospel because it was living in a way that was contrary to how Jesus lived and what he preached. Don't forget that at this time, many of the people that were alive and in Corinth would have heard of Jesus. They maybe even had gone to hear him or to listen, to see him, to be, some of them were even healed by him. So they would have known the things that Jesus taught. They would have known the way that Jesus lived. They would have seen what was happening with his disciples. And now they're looking at this church and they're remembering what Jesus had said versus what they're seeing with their eyes. So this is an important part here. So I'm going to throw another question at you at this point, and then we're going to stop with the questions for a period of time. But the second question I have is this. Believers and non-believers can become entangled in judgments to condemn the sins of other followers and consequently become entangled in them themselves. How can we more effectively deal with the offenses of other people that we see? What can we do? What would you do if you became aware of these issues in the life of a brother or sister in Christ? Some questions. Consider that. Feel free to put your answers in the comment. So let's get into Corinth, and let's get into what kind of a city it was and where it was located and why the people were the way they were. So Corinth lay on a narrow strip of land between the Corinthian Gulf and the Saronic Gulf. And this location really did make sure that the city would be prosperous commercially. It was strategically placed. It was in a really great position to have lots of people coming into port. And so the economic success of the city was pretty much guaranteed. And the other thing is that although Athens was the intellectual center, Corinth shared some of the characteristics with Athens. So its inhabitants were Romans, veterans, freedmen, Greeks, and Gentiles. And so when we look at this, we can say, so the Isthmian Games were conducted every 2 years just outside the city of Corinth. So, of course, this is attracting athletes from various parts of the country, which added another component to the spiritual atmosphere of the city. There's a lot of things going on here. It's kind of like a metropolis that we would have anywhere today. Like, say, for an example, if I said to you Los Angeles, North Hollywood, like if I talked to you about places like that, or New York, you immediately have a feeling of what goes on in that. Well, that is pretty much how it was in Corinth. They attracted this wide group of people who came in from every area to live so that they could be successful in business, or to be able to further their intellect, or whatever their athleticism, whatever it was. There's just a whole melting pot of people that was happening in this city. So Corinth was a hub city whose influence was felt in every direction. So Corinth was kind of a place where, people looked to see what was happening in Corinth, and then they did likewise a lot of the times. So any movement that was gained that gained a footing in Corinth could be assured that it would go to other cities. So kind of like Los Angeles. What happens in Los Angeles travels around the world. It does. And whatever happens in Hollywood travels around the world. So Leon Morris has described this important city as intellectually alert, materially prosperous, and morally corrupt. So interesting choice of words there. So that could tell you a lot about that city, but also, again, if you consider that in light of where we are today, how different is that in comparison to where you're living right now? Corinth was the most prosperous city in all of Greece, and it was a trading center, and it ranked with Ephesus and Antioch as a trade city. However, there was a great material distance between the rich and the poor. So there was that tier system, the very wealthy and the very poor. And so we see that in a lot of cities today. We see it in a lot of cultures today. And that was what was happening in Corinth. The Corinthian church reflected the lifestyle of the city, both socially and financially. So yeah, consider that. The Corinthian church reflected the Corinthian church. The church had taken on the characteristics of the lifestyle of the city, socially, financially, and I'll add morally. So, it was, instead of the church being the one that brought forth how to live, it was the city that was saying, this is how we live. And the church just fell right into that. So the exact population cannot be determined. Estimates run from 100,000 to 600,000 people. That's a big difference. But when you go to Israel, I didn't go to see Corinth when I was there, but when you're in that area and you look at some of the cities, it can be difficult to tell how many people would live there, simply because people lived in very small quarters for the most part, and so it can be difficult to determine that kind of thing. And they are walled cities, and so it's not always the easiest thing to determine. So as we continue, one of the most significant factors in the atmosphere of Corinth was their gross, unashamed immorality. The city was known far and wide for its looseness in all things intimate. So it wasn't just in the city of Corinth, but because everything that happened in Corinth went out to the cities around them, other people that were in the area, neighboring cities and ports, knew about how the Corinthians lived. So they knew what kind of morality they held and what kind of things they held to. the most prominent site, and I'll add this because this is important to understand as we talk about and continue to talk about Corinth. The most prominent site was the Corinth, and that's a mountain that was approximately 1,800 feet high. And on the very tip of that mountain, on the summit of that mountain, was the temple of Aphrodite, which, for your information, is a symbol of lust. And that spirit was seen in the heart and the attitude of the city. I think it's interesting. Many years ago, I had a mentor who said to me, if you want to know what the stronghold of a city is, then you look to see what the tallest points in the city are. And that will give you an idea of what that is. So when you look in your city, what is the tallest buildings that you have? It could be economics. It could be, your universities. It could be hospitals. There's many different things. It could be the church, right? So, but you'll have an idea of what the stronghold is over that city. In this case, the stronghold over the city was this spirit of lust, right? So an interesting thought there, to be sure. So the worship of this goddess was oriental and had been imported from the Phoenician cult of Astarte. You might have heard that name before. So the temple in Corinth maintained this temple of Astarte in Corinth maintained 1,000 priestesses who were not really priestesses at all, but they were cult workers or workers of intimate immorality, if I can put it that way. And so the attitude of the church toward this kind of immorality involved no condemnation whatsoever. So on the contrary, it was considered to be a pretty normal part of life. So the attitude of the city toward intimate immorality was acceptance. And doesn't that sound familiar today? So the same loose attitude that was often reflected in the church is the same attitude that was being reflected in the city. That same looseness of morality. And the case that Paul addresses in this book regarding the man and his father's wife were an example of that kind of immorality. If it feels good, do it. Who cares? It doesn't matter. Just go ahead. So the Christian view of marriage had been shaped by the mind and the culture of this city. So you have Christians that are living in this environment, adopting some of the beliefs that they had in the city of Corinth, and they're living their life and their marriage according to the dictates of the city, as opposed to the dictates of what Christ said when he was on the earth. That can't work out very well. So most of the members of the church were Gentiles who had been deeply ingrained in the current culture and had already lived that lifestyle outside of the church, had visited the temple of Astarte, had gone to those places and done those things and lived in that immorality. And so it was so deeply ingrained in them that it didn't seem like it was wrong. And so they'd taken on that culture. So the strict morality of what the Jews lived and how they lived according to the things that were said in the Old Testament in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy was so foreign to them because they couldn't understand why somebody would be living that way when they would be able to enjoy themselves and satisfy the desires of their flesh. So the Gentiles that were in the church found it difficult to understand that what they once considered a normal way of living was now considered sinful. And they couldn't really understand why it was sinful. So it makes you wonder how the teaching was coming forth, and it gives you a pretty good idea. But then what about Jesus, right? So the idolatry of the city was also closely connected to immorality. So idolatry, immorality, in addition to the temple of Aphrodite, there was numerous other temples and numerous other gods and things like that. So these idol temples played a significant role, both economically and in their social life. Things like sacrificing animals to idols were an economic boost to some, right? If you were somebody who raised cattle, it ensures that you're going to have your animals bought so that they could be sacrificed at the temple. So there's an economic boost for those who were farmers and ranchers and that kind of thing. So some of the meat that was sacrificed was burned on the sacrifice, and some of it was eaten by the priests, and then they took some of it and they sold it in the markets. So I'm just kind of laying out how this whole book is how we're gonna address some of these things. I'll bring a lot of this back in as we move forward. So you can understand then the concern of some of the people, because there'd be no way for them to know whether the meat that they just bought at the market had come from the altar of some pagan temple. So when a citizen went to buy meat or go to dinner, they had no way of knowing whether the meat served was kosher or not kosher, whether it was clean or unclean, whether it had been served to an idol or not. They had no idea. And for those who wanted to follow the teachings of Paul and the teachings of Jesus, this would have been a massive concern. And it was a massive point of division in the church. And this created a problem. And like I said, some people felt that there was no harm at all whatsoever in eating meat that was sacrificed to idols, while others felt that they were participating in idolatry when they ate it. How would you feel? What's your thought on that? Would you be okay with doing something that other people felt was okay, but you were convinced in your heart was not okay? What do you do, and how would you be able to skirt this issue if you were in this position at the time? Interesting thought. Please leave your comments because I do want to know your thoughts on it. So, given this kind of thinking, there was the problem of whether the social elite should attend the feasts given to idol temples. So, again, here's another thought process on this. These feasts were like important dinner parties of today and were considered outstanding social events. So, when you pay, $500 a plate in order to go and have a meal with somebody important, where you are going to rub shoulders with people that could help influence your business or help to, make your business prosperous or, give you more contacts. Should these people that were Christians and who were businessmen, prominent, wealthy businessmen in the church, should they attend these dinners, these feasts? And the thing is, many of the important Gentiles received invitations from these dinners and from these feasts because they had been there prior to their salvation. And the thing is, if they didn't go, it could really impact their business. It could really deplete their resources. So I'm just really bringing a lot of things to the surface so that we can look at it with a more understanding of mind of what was going on at the time. So I don't know how you would handle that or what you would do if you were a prominent businessman. Would you not go? Would you go? How would you handle that? And that, again, another interesting thought. So the Greeks considered matter, so things, evil, and the spirit was good. So therefore, they found the thought of having a resurrection of the body extremely distasteful. So they couldn't wrap their mind around it. Greeks are people of the mind, very intellectual. They went into all the study, and that was happening in Corinth as well. There was a lot of beliefs coming in, and people were hearing things, and they were studying things, and then they'd bring that into the church. And so there was a lot of chaos around what was good and what was evil. And what about the resurrection of the body? It doesn't make any sense, right? So why would there be you eat, live, enjoy life, and then you die, as kind of the thinking at the time. So Corinth believed enough of this Greek belief to view the doctrines of resurrection with suspicion. So the whole city went, it doesn't make sense, it doesn't seem right, because it doesn't make sense to my mind. And that was also coming into the church, right? So lots of problems going on in this particular body. The people were democratic, and they were also intolerant of any kind of control. The church had what I would call an independent spirit that they got from the city, and this quickly became very competitive. When anybody has an independent spirit, they feel like what they're doing is right and the way they're living is right, and they want to do what they want to do, and they don't want input from anybody else, and they're going to do what they want to do when they want to do it and how they want to do it. This is an independent spirit, and it brings in a lot of other things that can be really harmful to people as they continue to walk their life out. So if you feel like at any time you might be bordering on this, it'd be a really great idea to begin to come before the Lord and to repent and ask him to forgive you, and just to humble yourself and submit yourself to the Lordship of God. I think it's important for us to always remain humble before him, so that he can do all things that he wants to do in and through us. When we have an independent spirit, then we begin to shut out some things that the Spirit of the living God is doing because we can't wrap our head around it. That's never a good place to be, because God doesn't deal always with our intellect, although he will speak to us intellectually. He deals spirit to spirit, deep to deep. And so my thoughts on that. As we continue to say that the city of Corinth was a city that was busy with commerce, and which I've said already before, and it was also proud of its philosophical thinking. There was many traveling teachers that promoted whatever teachings it was that they were believing in, whatever newest, latest thing they heard, they were promoting it and they were teaching it, and their speculations and their intellectual interpretations in the city. And they were just going corner to corner and person to person, and they were just all of this from all of these different people with all of these different beliefs. They're all talking about different things. And some of these things were applied by a few churchgoers that were, and they were applying it to their faith. And so, we've seen some of that. I can look back and I can think back. I got saved in 1986. And, when you look at that, there was a lot of things that were happening at that time. But I look back at the belief system that people had then and what was taught in the church, and very much what's being taught today. There's some things that maybe aren't as, maybe I shouldn't go here. Maybe I'll just leave that thought hanging in midair. So you can consider that what I didn't say by saying what I didn't say, if that makes sense. So we need to make sure that whatever it is that we believe is grounded in the gospel. And if it's not, because there are things that can sound good, things that can feel good, and things that, that make sense to us. But the reality is, if they're not backed up by what the Word of God says, or by what Jesus believed, who Jesus is and who the Father is, who the Trinity is, or any of that, we need to discard it. So take that for what you will. So although it may have sounded good, and perhaps it did feel good, and you might not have been able to soundly argue against it using the scripture and the teachings of Christ, it did cause division. Again, this was another tension point. The fruit that was being produced was not good. It was not godly fruit that was happening inside that church. What did end up happening was that the church became a congregation of different schools of thought and was therefore no longer united in the gospel. There was division, there was arguing, and there was rampant sin. And those are the things that are bound to happen when you have proud, independent thinking individuals in leadership. And when I say independent thinking, I don't mean independent thinking that leads to good things in the church. I mean independence in the fact that you're going to do what you want, regardless of whether other people get hurt, regardless of whether it goes against what the gospel teaches. I mean an independent spirit, which isn't a good thing. So those are some of the things that were happening. Pride happens whenever. If you can't have an independent spirit if you're not proud. Those two things walk hand in hand. Add to that they were depending on human wisdom. They were depending on earthly, soulish intellect. And they had adopted and incorporated so many of these worldly ideas and thoughts that were coming into the city and that were being spoken in the temples and in the in the streets, in conversations and coffee shops. They'd adopted so many of those worldly ideas that they had a recipe for a downward slippery slide, which is pretty much exactly what happened to the city of Corinth, or the church in Corinth. So the Bible says that we are called and we are set apart as priests and kings unto our God. So a saving relationship with Jesus Christ is not found in intellectual wisdom, but by faith alone. So my last set of questions on this is this: do you see any different schools of thought within Christianity today? And if you do, how do you know what to discard and what to keep? And finally, what do you believe? What do you believe? So leave your comments, leave a like it, share it, subscribe to this channel. There's going to be more next week. We're going to be starting on 1 Corinthians chapter 1, or maybe Friday we'll start on that. And like I said, there'll be other times when I'm going to be talking about other issues, and maybe have a guest or two on from time to time. So I do still want to be able to have a live where we're able to have conversations together. I have no idea how to do that at this point on this platform, but I'm going to figure this out. So bear with me as we do so. I hope you enjoyed the first introduction to 1 Corinthians, and I hope to see you next time. Blessings to you. Have a great afternoon. Bye.